It's a little terrifying because you absolutely cannot miss.
Goalies now are completely at a premium.
Not, right? Like, Canada doesn't have a ton of great options.
What's up, hockey fans, or at least those who are still awake after, 4.5 hours of the NHL draft? Yes, this is the NHL Draft Live Frenzy. We're presented by Sticks.com. Why break the bank on sticks when you get a pro-level composite stick without the pro price tag at Sticks.com? Yes, that is Stix.com. Head over now and gear up. And we are live in LA with Ryan Kennedy, our editor-in-chief and draft guru, as well as Tony Ferrari with the Hockey News, our draft analyst. So I'm surrounded by the experts, guys. And give me your expert opinion, Ryan. This was the first decentralized draft. Hopefully it's the last decentralized draft. General thoughts on this experiment and whether we're going to go back to this.
I would say it did not work out. It was longer than the typical draft. There was the technical problems, like teams like Boston and Ottawa couldn't even hear. We were promised all sorts of great technology. We basically just got Zoom calls. So from that perspective, I don't see why they would do this again. The theater wasn't even full, which was very surprising to me. There was like big chunks of empty seats, and I thought like, oh, maybe somebody's going to sit there later on. But like, it got to pick 5 and 6. It's like, nope, they're just not coming. So I think this was a lesson for the NHL, and maybe a bit of an "I told you so" moment for Gary Bettman, for his GMs, that you don't mess with something that works.
Yeah, Steve Mayer does a lot of great producing. He does a lot of great events for the NHL. This one probably missed the mark. I'm with you. No draft should take 4.5 hours. Tony, what were your thoughts? Obviously, you and I were covering last year's draft alongside Ryan in Vegas in the Sphere, which was arguably one of my best experiences covering the draft. Is this one where you're kicking? Do you have like FOMO right now, Tony, on missing out on this draft?
Usually I would have had FOMO. I definitely would have been upset that I'm missing out. But like Ryan said, they scanned the crowd immediately, and it was like, oh, there's just a bunch of empty seats. You didn't have the same energy. Even people in the city were talking about how around the venue it was like NHL, but normally you're getting a ton of NHL in the entire city when everything's there. You're running into Lou Lamoriello at a Starbucks like I did a couple years ago in Nashville. You're running into people just out on the streets. That's the vibe that you get. This, I think it took away from that. And watching online, on TV and stuff, it just wasn't the same output of passion that there normally is at the draft. It was a bit of a weird experience. And I look back and I go, the NBA does Radio City Music Hall every single year. They found their venue, they stick to their venue, and they put on a great product. Everyone loves the NBA draft, and it's decentralized and it's their thing. The NHL is a bit of a copycat league, and they always copy other leagues and try to take things that they do well. And decentralization was one of them. In this scenario, I think the NHL needs to go back to a centralized draft, do their thing well, and find a location that really works for them year after year. The way you mentioned the Sphere last year in Vegas, I talked about it earlier on Twitter, that go back to the Sphere, do the Sphere every year if you want to sit in one location, book it for the next 20 years if you need to. That was an incredible experience. Even people I talked to that watched on TV, it was fantastic. And you had the advantage of taking away from the 45 people on stage by having a small stage, and then you had the picture in the back with everyone from the team. So there's a lot of tweaks to work out, the technical difficulties, the hoopla around the draft. So I think, it wasn't the greatest experience, to say.
No, we got to see some fun cameos. Seeing Adam Sandler was interesting. Tom Green was, out there. Michael Samuelson, I don't know if anyone had him on their bingo card as to, who was Vancouver going to roll out. But Ryan, any favorite moments from this year's draft in terms of the cameo, in terms of, maybe some of the emotion that we saw? Because it seemed like, I don't know, someone made a joke like tears per 60 were through the roof. Everyone was very emotional tonight, and there was a lot of love shown between the actual draft picks. Like as they were walking down, I don't remember seeing that many players getting, high-fived and hugged in previous drafts.
Yeah, when it came to that, it was kind of funny because all the players were basically on two sides of a section, so they were all in big rows. So anytime somebody got picked, they literally had like 25 players. They were like, "Hey, way to go, way to go!" And it's like, "Okay, guys, come on, like, way to go." In terms of obviously Matthew Schaefer led the charge, making the nod to the purple ribbon on his jersey and getting obviously overwhelmed, which was an incredible moment to begin with the draft with. And obviously very real. For me, in terms of the celebrities, Nikki Glaser was great. I was hoping she would be here and not in St. Louis. That was my big thing. I thought everybody was going to be here, but most of them were remote. Like Shea Weber was clearly golfing.
Decentralized, Ryan.
Yeah. He was decentralizing a sand trap. But Nikki Glaser did a couple of great jokes, and I thought that was really fun. When I heard that she was going to be here or on the draft, I was like, "Oh, that's an amazing get." So unfortunately, it was remote, but at least she was still really funny.
Yeah, you mentioned Matthew Schaefer. Let's start there. Obviously, the number 1 overall pick. Surprise, surprise. The New York Islanders go for the stud defenseman in Matthew Schaefer. Both you guys had Schaefer as your number 1. I'm curious. Remind me again to ask afterwards how correct your draft board was. At least even for the top 10. But, Tony, what did you think of, the Islanders obviously going with the obvious pick in Schaefer?
Well, I think the big thing with Schaefer is you look at him versus the rest of the defensive class, and there seemed to be such a big gap that having him go number 1 made so much sense. He's a fantastic mobile defenseman that doesn't get the love for his defensive game that he has, but he's a really good defender, uses his feet well there, and then he has the dynamism offensively. And like this is a stud of a kid as well. Like I've talked to him a few times a year, every year since he was 15, before he was even drafted into the OHL. I remember talking to him after the Canada Winter Games, and he's always been charismatic. He's always been a guy that you can tell how much he loves the game, but how much he loves the camaraderie of the teammates that he has as well. I think he's going to be a fantastic Islander, and it made so much sense considering the gap between Michael Misa and Anton Frundell and some of the other forwards wasn't nearly as big as the gap between Schaefer and the rest of the defensive class.
What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I thought it was definitely the correct pick for the Islanders, especially since they ended up trading Noah Dobson to Montreal. But this was actually a really good night for New York. And I know their fans were trying to get James Hagens. They were trying to will that to happen with that trade. It didn't happen. But they got Victor Eklund at number 16. This is a player that I thought was going to be top 10. We had him number 7 in draft preview. And I get it. He's not the biggest player and he's not a center, but he's got a crazy motor. And, he's already produced at the World Juniors. He's already played against men back in Sweden. And then they get Keishon Aitchison, one of my favorite players in the draft, with the next selection. So you get Schaefer, who could be a superstar defenseman, and then you get 2 guys that are going to be really hard to play against. And I think Isles fans are going to love both Eklund and Aitchison because Aitchison as a defenseman, he really broke out offensively this season with the Barrie Colts. He already had that defensive game that's so intimidating because he's so physical and flat out mean on the ice. Off the ice, he's a great kid. But I think, this could really be a foundational draft for New York under their brand new GM, Matthew Darche.
Yeah, just to remind everyone that trade was Noah Dobson going from the Islanders to the Montreal Canadiens in exchange for Emil Heineman, who was second rounder back in 2020, as well as the 16th and 17th picks. And as Ryan mentioned, Victor Eklund goes 16th, and then Keishon Aitchison goes 17th. Eklund was a top 5 pick, or at least
7th.
Was he 7th? Oh, sorry. So both guys, he was 7th, and Aitchison was, I think, ranked 9th in the magazine.
Correct.
Am I correct in that one? Yes.
Yeah.
So they give both guys a steal, and I guess Eklund, one of the, along with Hagens, one of the guys that dropped with the number 2 overall selection. San Jose Sharks, they just add to their forward group with Michael Misa. He joins Will Smith, Macklin Celebrini, and another Eklund and William Eklund there. So what did you think of the Misa pick, Ryan?
Yeah, I thought it was the right way to go. There was a lot of rumors that Anton Frondel was going to go to San Jose. Obviously, that didn't come to fruition. But I like Misa for the Sharks. You got Macklin Celebrini, who's your number one center. You have Will Smith, who can play center or be on the wing. And now you have Michael Misa, who can be a center or he can play on the wing. So if you're the Sharks, you now have three really high-end players. Plus, as you mentioned, William Eklund, who's already been there a couple of years, starting to blossom. You're seeing, a top six that's really beginning to come together. And then Tyler Toffoli, the veteran, it's always good to have a guy like that who already has some chemistry with the kids. The Sharks are probably going to be bad again this year, but that's okay. You're going to start seeing experience from these guys. And, let's see if Misa makes it, right? I mean, he absolutely dominated the CHL, but the NHL is a different step. There's a nice little bit of freedom there for San Jose. They don't have to rush him to the NHL. One of the big storylines in developmental hockey right now is the CHL versus NCAA. Could we see Michael Misa go to the NCAA if he does not make the Sharks out of camp? It's all on the table now and very fascinating.
No, it is fascinating. And, I don't know, where the draft started to get a little, where there was a bit of mystery because, as I was following, you saw some people say, okay, maybe Anton Frondel would go number 2, possibly. Is Misa the right pick? How did you see it, Tony? And, did San Jose, choose right in this decision?
Yeah, I think they made the right pick. For me, all year long, it was Misa and Schaefer that were kind of 1A, 1B for my draft board, and I think Misa is going to be a really solid top 6 player for the San Jose Sharks. It's one of those situations where, like Ryan said, you have both him and Will Smith, who are wingers, maybe centers, and you can figure out which one's going to be the second line center. And then the other one gets on the wing. You have Tyler Toffoli, Quinton Musty's coming for that team as well. There's a lot of talent in that top 6 in a few years, and it's going to be really interesting to see just how envious teams are of that San Jose top 2 centers, which will probably end up being Macklin Celebrini and Michael Misa, 2 players who are really smart, really tactical, two-way players who can be impactful at both ends of the ice. I think they made the right pick, and I mean, even if they made the Frondel pick, it wouldn't have been a bad pick, but they really solidified a top 2 centers that I think is going to be the envy of the league in a few years.
You mentioned Frondel. Obviously, he goes to Chicago with the number 3 pick. Goes to a Chicago team that obviously Connor Bedard needs all the help he can get. Frondel says he mirrors his game after a guy like Sasha Barkov in the magazine. The best case NHL comparable is Robert Thomas. Both guys. I'm sure Chicago would be happy if he turns out to be one or the other. Tony, Frondel, what is he bringing to the Chicago Blackhawks, and why is this the right pick for them right now?
He's a power forward, and he went to the Blackhawks in terms of just his ability to kind of work off the wall, working inside to the inside, and really lean on players. So I think Frondel's a great pick for them in terms of just the ability to bring a different element. If he ends up at center, that's awesome, because then you have Bedard up on the first line, kind of freelancing and doing all his things, and then you have a guy like Frondel in the second line who's able to be a little bit more of a two-way center and bring a little bit more power to the game.
Ryan, what did you think of Frondel? Is that where you kind of had him as well?
I had him sort of in that kind of like 1 to 5 range. His stock seemed to be going up a little bit towards the end of the season. And I totally agree with Tony. I think it's a great fit in Chicago where, in an ideal world, Anton Frondel takes the tougher matchups, and that allows Connor Bedard to be that offensive juggernaut player that we hope he can be at the NHL level. We know that, Bedard had matchup problems, particularly this season, where we expected a little more from him offensively. So with Frondel, and let's not forget Frank Nazar as well, an up-and-coming player in Chicago who has been playing center and wants to play center, but now this gives Chicago a little bit of leeway in saying, like, okay, much like San Jose, it's like we have options here. So, yeah, I really liked Frondel. And, again, Chicago had 3 picks in the first round, and I think they made the most of them.
Yeah. I guess if there had been a defenseman ranked higher, maybe Chicago thinks about bolstering their back end, but, with who was available, you're basically choosing between a lot of forwards. One forward who actually kind of fell outside the top 5, or two of them, were Porter Martone and James Hagens. Instead, at the number 4 spot, to Utah, Caleb Denho. I'm gonna butcher this, Ryan, because you're used to me butchering it. So, like, let's have it. How do you say the last name?
Denoyer.
Oh boy. And I took university French. Well, failed it the first
You
time.
did better than the golfer. You said Moncton.
Yeah, Moncton, from Moncton. That's right. Yeah, what did you make of this one? Obviously, Utah is, they're building over there. I feel like this year they're going to be making that jump to, potential, a playoff team, wildcard team. Obviously, Caleb's probably not going to be part of that this year, but we'll talk about how many guys you think are actually capable of making the jump. But what did you think of this pick, Ryan?
Yeah, it was interesting. Slightly higher than I thought, but not by much. I think I probably had Denoyer 6. You look at GM Bill Armstrong in Utah, and he loves size. And Denoyer is not huge, but he is 6'1", 6'2", I think. And he plays a really solid game, a heavy game, I would say. I remember at the CHL NTDP series, the Canadian coach, Chris Millette, was saying, like, that's a man already in Denoyer, the way he played. So, he put up a ton of points, and he had a wrist injury that he played through. So imagine what he'd be like 100% healthy all the time. I think this is a player that, again, when you forecast, you look at Utah, Logan Cooley's a small center, so you can't do another small center in your top 6. It's just not going to work. But Caleb Denoyer has plenty of size. So now you have a pretty nice 1-2 punch there for your future. And again, you bring in a JJ Pateka on the wing. You got Clayton Keller already, Dylan Gunther. Now you're starting to see what the Mammoth could look like in a couple of years. And it looks, pretty impressive.
Yeah, Bill Armstrong's doing a heck of a job with drafting and developing these guys. What did you think of Caleb Denoyer? Tony, obviously, he's a strong guy in the faceoff dot. He seems to have a winning pedigree everywhere he goes. He's a part of winning teams, whether at the Canadian level or in the junior level.
Yeah, Caleb Denoyer is an interesting player because I've had my concerns on him. I've been lower on him than consensus, but this pick made all the sense in the world for a team like Utah, where, like Ryan said, they have a guy that's going to play in their top 6 that's a little bit smaller and Cooley. And Denoyer is a really stout, steady play connector who will play in the top 6 probably, and he's a smart player. He's not opportunistic. He's a guy that when something presents itself, he's going to take advantage of it every time. And I think that's where Utah goes with a player like him, because like Ryan said, they draft a lot of big players over the last few years, and Denoyer is not small by any means, but he's not a 6'5" guy. You can't draft a 6'5" guy every single year, as much as Utah has tried. So I think Denoyer is a great pick for them. He's a smart tactical center, and it fits in kind of with what they want to go with.
All right, rounding out the top 5, straight from the farm in Elmira, Ontario. Wasn't there tonight. Brady Martin, whose agent Cam Stewart's always telling me about how, salt of the earth this guy is, and just what a moment. Like, a lot of these guys will, travel all the way to LA to be part of the draft. And, Brady's like, no, I got more important things to do. I got to help my family on the farm. Ryan, this was, maybe a bit of a stretch, based on where we were seeing Brady Martin ranked. Is this a bit of a reach? Was this kind of a mini surprise for you?
It was a little bit of a surprise, but not that much, because he was really trending up. And I know in draft preview, I think I had him like 11 or 12, something like that. But, like, we closed almost 2 months ago, and like the hype around Brady Martin just kept getting bigger and bigger because of how he played at the World Under-18s. And, I'm sure, his combine interviews helped as well. But here's another complaint for me. They knew he was at the farm. They didn't interview him. They just showed him some B-roll of him feeding some calves and playing with puppies. It's like, he's there. Like, just put a camera on him and be like, hey,
farm,
here. What's that?
It's a puppy farm.
I don't think that's the term you want to use. But yeah, like, he's right there. Just talk to him. But anyways, great fit for Nashville if it pans out, because the Predators really have never had a legit number one center. Like the closest they've had is Ryan Johansson, and I would call him more of a 1B, 1A kind of guy. So, I mean, Brady Martin, the way he's played and the fact that he put up points on a Greyhounds team that really didn't have a lot of talent around him, I think really speaks to his potential. And yeah, I think Preds fans are going to love him.
Yeah, Tony, was that a surprise for you? There were quite a few surprises tonight. Oh, I think we lost Tony.
How's that? I think
There
I'm
we
back.
go.
But no, it was a little bit of a surprise, but not one I'm completely blown away by, because this kid really does bring Smashville right to the surface. Like, he's throwing hits, chasing guys down. He's a physical player, and like Ryan said, his stock flew up at the end of the year, and the U18 certainly played a role. But I don't know if there was anything that rose his stock more than Sam Bennett winning the Conn Smythe. Like, the way a guy like that impacted a Stanley Cup winner now in back-to-back years in the playoffs, Brady Martin's stock just seemed to skyrocket every time. Sam Bennett had a big moment, whether it was taking out the other team's goalie or scoring a big goal. Brady Martin's stock seemed to jump a pick or two. So it wasn't exactly entirely shocking, but it was probably a little higher than I expected.
That's interesting. Yeah, I wonder how many teams kind of went into this draft thinking, all right, I got to get the next Matthew Tkachuk or Sam Bennett or even Aaron Ekblad. It's definitely a blueprint that you want to follow just based on the success that the Panthers have had. One guy who, didn't benefit from probably those kind of comparisons, James Hagens. Ryan, going into this season, James Hagens, in a lot of people's minds was probably, the presumptive number one overall pick. Obviously, as the season went on, his time at Boston College didn't put up the gaudy numbers that many were expecting, and ended up falling all the way to 7th to Boston, to the Boston Bruins. Going from Boston College to the Boston Bruins is a pretty sweet for a guy like James Hagens. Is this one where 6 other teams are going to maybe be kicking themselves a couple years from now?
You know what? And first, I'll say he was really stoked to be a Bruin, and part of it was the Boston College connection, and the fact that he's famously from Long Island, but it's not that far to go from New York to Boston, so it's great for his family as well. But you know what? I mean, 6 teams, I'm not sure. I'm sure the Islanders are fine with Matthew Schaefer, but I do think Hagens is going to be a very solid NHL player. And we were talking about this up here in Press Row. 5 years down the line, the order of the draft isn't going to matter so much, right? Like, players are going to have better fits in certain places. And, you look back and, like a Brady Tkachuk probably should have gone higher, or even Matthew Tkachuk for that matter, or a Quinn Hughes should have gone higher. But a lot of factors go into that. I think with Hagens, he got dinged by being smaller than the other centers in that top end group. It literally happens every year, right? Like, he's under 6 foot. He's going to get dinged. It doesn't mean that he's not going to turn into a great pro, but teams get nervous, or they just I mean, Tony, that's a fantastic point about Brady Martin. He essentially plays the Sam Bennett game, where I think you look at James Hagens, he's more of a Jack Hughes, and I mean, Hughes obviously has shown us some incredible offensive upside in the NHL, but he's also gotten hurt a couple of times. And is that because he has a smaller frame? Might have been a factor. So, I think it's a great spot for Hagens, and he's definitely got some motivation now when he plays some of those other teams.
Hey, Tony, like, Porter Martone is a guy that should have benefited from that whole Florida comparable. I'm looking here, best case, Matthew Tkachuk. This is a guy that likes to hit, likes to fight. He's got the size. Probably he goes to a market in Philly that is going to appreciate him like no other market. A very old school Flyers type of pick. Is that enough of a surprise, him falling to 6th overall? Not
really, because I think Porter Martone and James Hagens both, they suffered a little bit from being over scouted. They're guys that have been on international teams a year above because of when they're born. They're guys that have been in the spotlight, playing at U18s for a couple extra years, and in really getting seen by everyone. So this year, when they come into their draft year, they start the season really high, and then they start to get nitpicked. And I think both of them fell to great spots, and I think both of them are going to be really, really great fits with the teams that got them. But with Porter Martone and Philly, I think one of the big things was everyone looked at his size and they went, we want a power forward. And there's elements of power forward in his game, but I think everyone thinks the traditional power forward drops his shoulder, drives to the net, scores those greasy goals from in tight. And Porter Martone has some of that, but he's more of a power playmaker. That's why you talk about best case scenario and Matthew Tkachuk comes up, because he's a guy that isn't necessarily going to blow dudes up. He's going to be able to kind of take on defenders, use his strength to hold them off, and make plays under it. He's a playmaker at heart with a really good shot, similar to the way Matthew Tkachuk is. A guy that really isn't going to be bothered by contact, but he's not going to initiate contact a lot of times. So I think he's going to be fantastic in Philly. I instantly, when he was drafted, I was like, him and Michkov on opposite wings with a guy like Jet Luchenko down the middle, that brings a little bit more responsibility to the line. That's a really interesting trio of guys that could work really well in Philly for a number of years.
Did you have a guy that, fell more than you expected, or was there, a team that maybe reached and you're like, hey, that's a great pick? Was there any pleasant surprises or just anything that way, Tony?
For me, it was Lyndon Lakovich falling all the way to 27. I think the element of not being a physical guy as a 6'4" winger was certainly there, and I think that's why he fell a little bit. But I look at this guy and I'm like, he plays the way a guy that's 6'1", 6 foot plays. He has so much skill, so much speed, just the creativity that he plays with. It's all there. Everything you want from a guy like Cullen Potter or someone like that who fell in the draft as well, but he fell because his size wasn't there. Lyndon Lakovich fell because his physicality didn't match his size. And I think that might be something teams look back on and go, man, I can't believe 26 of us passed on a guy that ends up being possibly a top 10 player in the draft, because in a draft that featured a lot of players that will end up being probably third liners, middle six guys, Lyndon Lakovich is one of the few guys that has the upside, I think, to be an impact top six forward who really brings the skill and the intelligence to the game.
Have you, Ryan, anyone that you were kind of shocked by, he fell further or, was picked higher?
Yeah, in terms of falling, Malcolm Spence was not taken in the first round. And this is a player, I think before the season began was one to watch as maybe a top 10 guy. And I think, he wasn't in the best situation in Erie. Like, if you think about it, Matthew Schaefer, I think he played like 17 games or something. So imagine being on a power play with Matthew Schaefer and then being on a power play without Matthew Schaefer for 2/3 of the season. It's going to hurt your points. And they had a coaching change. And, Spence had a really gory tongue injury at one point. So, I mean, it was tough sledding for him. I'm sure he'll be early on day 2, but that to me was the biggest surprise. And then, Columbus taking Peter Andreanov, him being the first goalie off the board, being a Russian that no one had seen live, who only comes in at 6 foot flat. Apparently he moves really well, but I was pretty surprised at that one. I was like, whoa, like at number 20, like we didn't even know if a goalie was going to go in the first round. And I think most of us assumed if it was going to happen, it was Joshua Ravensbergen, who ended up going to San Jose 30th overall. But that Andreanov pick, that to me was a pretty surprising one.
The fact that San Jose got a goalie when they got Askarov, who's like 23 years old, that kind of is surprising. But I guess, the old adage, pick the best player, and, it's always a commodity or an asset come trade deadline time, having a guy that's good. So, Tony, who made out well today? If you're going to, call a winner, is it the Islanders because of what they ended up with? Obviously, they go back with 3 really good prospects to start this really kind of retool, if you want. Yeah. How did you see it?
I think the Islanders are an easy one. Anytime you have the first overall pick, you're usually the winner of the draft. Getting Schaefer, getting Victor Eklund, who was a top 10 guy easily, in my opinion. Getting him at 16. And then Aitchison, who's one of the more divisive guys at times, but the talent is there, the physicality is there, and you're certainly going to love him in a playoff series as well. So I think that's an easy one. But for me, it's Pittsburgh. I think they did a really good job trading down. They got some really interesting players. Ben Kindle's a really interesting pick where they got him. I thought that was a little higher than I was expecting, but Pittsburgh really did a good job of just going out and getting their kind of guys. I loved the Bill Zonin pick. I think he's a fantastic winger who brings a lot of the tenacity and power play playmaking elements that you want to see. And he forechecks maybe harder than anyone else in the draft class outside of maybe a Victor Eklund. So Pittsburgh was really impressive today, in my opinion, trading down, getting some really good players.
I'm getting called out for calling the Islanders rebuild a retool. Lebowski 5 saying it's a flat out rebuild. You're probably right. And then again, the Islanders, every time they go into the season, I'm never impressed with their team on paper, and they somehow, sometimes overachieve. So let's pump the brakes there. We'll see what it turns out to be, because now they could turn this around quickly. Ryan, give me your winner for today.
You know what? I'll go with Philly. I liked what Chicago did as well with 3 selections. Kindle was way too high for me, but that was like the ultimate Wes Clark, Kyle Dubas pick. It's like, if you're 5'10", and 176 pounds, we're going to take you way too early every year. But I did like the Zonin and Horkoff picks, so they made up for it, especially because Horkoff is 6'5". But Philly, like with Porter Martone and Jack Nesbitt, who they took number 12, like you got 2/3 of a really big line right there for the future, right? And Jack Nesbitt still has, a lot of filling out to do. And one of my favorite quotes from Draft Preview was, he's a 5'11" skill guy, but in a 6'4" frame. So that's kind of a nice feather in his cap. But I mean, for the Flyers, for having 2 picks when they did, I thought they did very well.
That's awesome. Yeah, and Draft Preview, Ben Kindle, you guys had him 27th. I know, like you said, it was done 2 months earlier, but I think most people thought it was a significant reach. Real quick, just on the Noah Dobson trade, do we like this one for Montreal? Like, obviously, you give up 2 picks, but, Montreal was a wild card team this year. I would argue that, they needed a player now versus those 2 picks. How much is Dobson going to help that blue line, guys?
Yeah, I think it's really big for them. And, you look at Montreal, they've drafted so much in the past few years, and they've done so well in the draft. And you think about, obviously, Lane Hudson just winning the Calder, and, they have some other young defensemen that are already on the team. But then you think, and like Michael Hage is still in university at Michigan, like that's another forward that will come up and help out, in the next couple of years. And obviously, Juraj Slafkovsky is still very young. Cole Caulfield's not that old. So, they still have a lot of good assets up front, and a lot of players will be coming through the system. So I do think that it was okay for them to kind of take the first round off in a weird way to get a guy like Noah Dobson, who's going to help them immediately. And then, I mean, think about it. Like at this point, Dobson or Hudson can be on the ice for like 2/3, 3/4 of the game. That's going to give other teams absolute fits when they're coming up the ice.
Yeah, that's my thing with this trade is you give yourself the option to have Hudson and Dobson play 40 minutes out of the 60 minutes, if not more. And you're going to be able to kind of dictate the way defensive pairings go up against you, because those X factors on the back end. It's going to be really interesting too, because coming into his sophomore season, I think everyone was going to hone in on Lane Hudson. They were going to go, that's the guy we have to stop in the back end. Well, now you have another player back there that can really burn you if you don't kind of give him the time of day. And like Ryan said, there's so many players up front. He mentioned a few. There's Owen Beck, another guy that has a lot of promise and could be a really solid third line center for them. So this team isn't perfect. They have a couple spots to fill. Certainly that second line center role is a bit of a glaring need, but with this year's Calder winner in Hudson, next year's Calder favorite in Ivan Demidov, this is a young team on the rise, and grabbing a guy like Dobson and getting him locked into a long-term contract is really important as well. So I thought it was a great trade for them, especially in a draft that, as I've described it, you're filling out a lot of the middle of your roster. There's not a lot of guys that are going to be top-line players coming out of this draft, especially outside the top few guys.
Awesome. Day 2 of the draft goes tomorrow. You're going to have to follow the hockeynews.com for Ryan and Tony's expert analysis. As well, on Tuesday, Canada Day, July 1, we have our free agency live frenzy where Ryan and I are going to be going live at 12 noon Eastern time up until 3 p.m. So obviously Sam Bennett signed for 8x8 today, and the Toronto Maple Leafs re-signed John Tavares, but there's still Brad Marchand's out there, Mitch Marner's out there. A lot of good players are out there for July 1. We'll see how many are still available when we actually go live. But thanks for joining us in this post-draft recap from the first round in Los Angeles with Ryan Kennedy and Tony Ferrari. I'm Michael Traikos. Thank you to Sticks.com and Yahoo Sports for the hockey news. We'll see you next time, folks.